We now just under 1.5 million. We should hit 1.5 million sometime in the next few days.
Wow.
Awesome.
About 2,000 joining a day on average at the moment. So yeah, I mean, it's really growing, very quickly at the moment. Obviously pretty unprecedented network for offline populations. But, I think for us, what's more exciting is that people actually use it. So, on the average day, we're actually now processing more questions and answers than Quora.
Hi, we are lucky to be joined today by Kenny Ewan, founder of WeFarm. Kenny, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
I'm really excited to talk about WeFarm, but I shall restrain myself so that before that we can get some context about your background. So, leading on from sort of your university, how did it all begin for you in your journey to WeFarm?
Probably like most great stories, or good stories, at least at this stage, kind of randomly. I graduated in architecture with a degree. I think the only thing I was clear about at that point was that I did not want to be an architect. So I took a 6-month job with a social enterprise in South America, helping them build construction projects. Went for my 6 months and ended up staying for 7 years.
Oh, wow.
So that was based out of Peru. I kind of specialized ultimately in building community projects, mostly fish farms, water systems, irrigation systems in indigenous communities.
You were managing it rather than physically, or both?
Both.
Right.
I physically did that from the kind of architecture background.
Sure.
Everything from laying cement and digging out Adobe bricks to thinking through bigger kind of project structures. But found something I was really passionate about. They offered me a management position after my 6 months and stayed, and ultimately when I left, I was kind of regional director for all of Latin America for the organization, and managing offices across various countries in Brazil, Mexico, Belize, and Peru. So yeah, it was a pretty incredible 7 years, and changed my life really.
Yeah, well, actually, it's like somebody who's a useful gap year adventurer, somebody who does something rather than just live off the lay of the land. In terms of those community projects, what kind of stuff were you giving back to the community? I know you said sort of fish projects, and were you empowering the community with the knowledge that you had?
Yeah, so I mean, most of the projects we did were one of the ground rules was the community had to come and ask us for something or outline a problem. Yeah, I mean, most commonly the communities we were working with in the very high Andes, above 4,000 meters. Very fertile soils, but the extreme altitude and weather meant that they couldn't really grow anything. Maybe just potatoes. Most of the kids, especially, were suffering from malnutrition. So that was one of the most common problems that they came to us with. And fish farms that could support sustainable protein through tilapia or trout were the kind of solution that we came up with. We built purely natural fish farms, so kind of like extensions in natural river systems with sluice gates rather than horrible concrete pits. So that's what we did for years across the high Andes. And I think in terms of what came next for me in WeFarm, there was some pretty powerful insights in that time. One of which was seeing almost from an outside perspective the big NGO projects that stuff that was coming from Geneva or Washington or wherever, multi-million-dollar projects that quite often local communities didn't need or want. Huge amount of waste in that. And secondly was in the projects I was seeing or doing, seeing the amount of innovation and local knowledge that was actually solving problems for people. And that was the kind of some of the sparks of the idea behind WeFarm was to look at how do we start getting these kind of local solutions into more people's hands.
Is there often a disconnect between the aid that, I don't know if it's still the correct term, but first world countries are offering and the aid that's actually required on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a subjective question, but my personal opinion is, hugely.
Yeah.
I think the aid industry and the kind of development industry has, largely grown towards, being able to sell itself to Western people. You've got to be able to sell a certain image for people to give money to things, and that's not necessarily, in context with what's actually needed on the ground.
Yeah.
My personal opinion is that aid works best for short-term solutions to crises, whether that's natural or whatever. But long-term development solutions, I think, very rarely come out of the type of things we think they do.
Because also, I guess, communicating that to first world countries, they want legacy. So the sustainable fishery you're talking about might seem a little hokey when you've got £1 million of charity funding to deploy, and they want to see, a dam built that really is going to impact it for years. And I imagine, to a degree as well, having a long-term view when charities are continuously re-fundraising, it makes it difficult to see through that infrastructure project to its sort of nth degree, where it's really going to be valuable continuously.
Because it takes 10 years to educate the people on the ground.
Yeah.
The people that are being marketed the charity want results straight. They want to see their money put to work, but they can't see the result. They can't see the results for 10 years. Then you can see how it's a harder sell.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with all of that, and I think, just like in animal charities, it's far easier to raise money for saving tigers than it is for some species of ants that nobody cares about. The same kind of principles apply in international work, where people want to give money to things that they are simple and are kind of dumbed down and they understand. You give £5, you get water for one person, but the reality is these are some of the most complex problems facing the world, and you don't solve them through these kind of ultra simplistic messages always. And I think that's been one of the major problems that I've seen, is that it ultimately gets taken down to these really simple things, and none of these problems are simple.
Yeah, we had an awful thing in the charity that I'm a trustee of, where they pointed out that it's really difficult for them to raise too much money, because then they're seen to be given loads of money, and then suddenly people stop feeling sorry for themselves, or sorry for that charity, and they look elsewhere to the one that seems to be more desperate. So you have to play this fine line between in need of the cash and obviously being successful at fundraising.
Well, it's like the beggar with the alms bucket has to remove the coins and put them behind his back, so exactly. It looks like he needs it.
Right. I mean, that's something we've seen, particularly in the early days at WeFarm, where we were pretty successful at getting people excited about what we were doing. Certainly after we got over the initial skepticism, but then ultimately, when you're applying for these kind of grants or prizes, you sometimes become a victim of your own success, and everybody wants the new thing, and which doesn't necessarily make much logical sense, but some of this isn't logical.
Well, let's drill down into that actually. So you went and worked with Cafe Direct, is that correct?
So I was part of the startup team for the Cafe Direct Producers Foundation.
Yeah. And what is Cafe Direct?
So Cafe Direct is a coffee company that was set up by Oxfam and a few other partners, years ago, about 30 years ago, the pioneers of the fair trade movement. For a long time, where if you were buying fair trade coffee in the UK, you were buying it from Cafe Direct. Very successful. But they always had a very, obviously, as the name suggests, a direct buying model from farmers themselves. In 2009, they took the kind of bold decision to set up a foundation that was owned by the farmers and not by them as a PLC, which was a really exciting model. And myself and Claire Rhodes were the startup team for that. Just going back to what we were talking about previously on the difficulties of fundraising. I mean, I think at CPF we did some incredible work, and they're now known as Producers Direct and still do incredible work. But it's very hard to raise money for sophisticated problems with farmer climate change solutions. It's not a public-facing thing, and I think it's a great example of how it's not necessarily the most important work that raises the most money.
Yeah, so and how did your role within them iterate? So you've obviously found that the initiative was successful, and at some point you've obviously started to coin the idea for WeFarm as it stands today. What was the sort of transition in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, the idea for WeFarm or what would become WeFarm was, initially kind of sketched out by Claire and I over a coffee table, as a project for CPF, for the foundation. We raised some grant money to do early prototypes and testing, what we now call bootstrapping, I guess, in the startup world, and it was pretty exciting. I think we saw people get into it very quickly. It looked like it was something that had tremendous potential, and CPF were prepared to kind of take a small equity stake in it and spin it out as a business and as a tech startup with a social mission, which I took on, and in 2015 we launched it, and it's been 4 crazy years since.
So it was a social enterprise at start.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd refer to it as a mission-driven company rather than social enterprise. I think has all sorts of connotations, but yeah, I mean, ultimately we are a for-profit tech startup that has a mission at the heart of what we do. Yeah,
so I mean, I wondered that because as it went on, that I saw in your comms that it became about finding a way of making it commercially sustainable, and so I was just wondering if it wasn't like that at the start, if it was just sort of like a real true social enterprise in that respect.
So I think the initial idea, like a lot of these things, it was purely about solving a problem. One of the things, growing out of what I'd previously discussed with experience in South America, one of the things we saw with farming in particular was climate change was starting to bring in new diseases in, say in Kenya that had only ever existed in Uganda or on the other side of the world, and the best people to actually provide advice to those farmers was farmers who'd been dealing with it for 20 years. And that was kind of the kind of grain of the idea of, how do we actually get people talking to each other, particularly in a, pre-internet economy, and sharing ideas. So, the nugget of the idea was simply that we started to go out and develop. But I think very early, the intention was to make it a business and to make it, sustainable and profitable.
Yeah.
Those were not afterthoughts. They were things that we very deliberately set out to do, but maintain that kind of social impact as well.
Right. So when Cafe Direct put the money in, the initial money, were they doing that with, because it came from the foundation, were they doing that with a return in mind, or was it just, this is another project of ours, go and solve a problem?
So the initial money we got to kind of do the pilots was actually from the Nominate Trust, now known as the Social Tech Trust, I believe.
Okay.
They gave us £70,000 to do the initial kind of pilots and set this up, and I think that was probably still before we had bigger ideas of launching it out.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, eventually, we start to think, all right, this needs to go beyond just a 6-month project. How do we make this a 10-year project to get millions of farmers involved in this? We took on the challenge of writing a business plan very early. Still, funny to look back on it now, but still remarkably similar to what we're actually doing. And then we got some money from Google. Actually, was where we got our kind of startup funding from. We won the Google Impact Challenge, which was my first big pitch in front of Peter Jones and Jimmy Wales and such like, which was absolutely terrifying. But we walked out of there with a large check,
right? And
we used that to set up WeFarm and go from there.
Well, yeah, and let's get the strap line on how anybody listening would understand what WeFarm does.
So WeFarm is essentially a peer-to-peer communications network for sharing knowledge that works even without the internet. So a farmer can ask us a question on SMS, just about any local language. WeFarm uses machine learning and the knowledge of the crowd to get them bespoke content back for free.
So as a sort of a layman's example, if I were a farmer...
So, say a chicken farmer in Kenya whose chicken is sick, or you may be a coffee farmer suffering from a disease, or you may want to try planting a new crop. I mean, obviously, literally millions of things it could be.
Yeah.
Send us an SMS just outlining your problem, your question. When WeFarm receives the question, we use machine learning to essentially analyze what you're telling us. What is the intent of the question? Where are you? What are you farming? As much context and data as we can get out of that. And essentially on the other side of that algorithm then saying, given all of this analysis, who do we think is the best person to answer this one individual question? So essentially, one person out of a million with a question and matching them to one person out of a million with an answer.
Okay, so it's different from Quora, where people post a question and then anyone can answer, is you actually direct the question so that hopefully the response is valid and useful rather than a crock of proverbial shite.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly hope that's a fair way of summing it up. Our median time to answer a question now is 13 minutes.
Oh, wow.
Even without in the internet. And I think that, it kind of always surprised me that more people like Quora haven't looked into that model of actually saying, no, we're picking you to answer this one individual question, which I think it's just a more powerful dynamic than anybody can do it.
Well, it's quite intimate. So, I mean, the example I used to use to try and understand it was like AQA, although obviously that was for very nebulous information. I mean, the orders of efficiency you're allowing these farmers is like you've taken them out of the sort of intellectual dark ages to really provide them a platform that can completely transform their lives. And what, to give people listening, how many farmers do you have on currently?
We now just under 1.5 million. We should hit 1.5 million sometime in the next few days.
Wow.
Awesome.
About 2,000 joining a day on average at the moment. So yeah, I mean, it's really growing, very quickly at the moment. Obviously pretty unprecedented network for offline populations. But I think for us what's more exciting is that people actually use it. So on the average day we're actually now processing more questions and answers than Quora, given the previous example.
How many questions have been asked?
So on most days we're averaging about 40,000 questions and answers a day, sometimes more. So we're doing information sharing I think on a global level, even though that's really mostly in 2 countries, in Kenya and Uganda, where we've been building penetration to date.
So how the user acquisition, how is that going at the rate it's going at? Because these are people who aren't on the internet tweeting about it and sharing, and so is that how are they?
Yeah, and it's not a world where Kim Kardashian tweeting about you gets you a few million users overnight. It might be, I don't know. most of our user acquisition comes through. I mean, virality is increasingly important for us, of just farmers telling other farmers. Our biggest kind of paid acquisition channel is radio. So we do a lot of radio work, a lot of content-driven work, very little, what we'd call traditional advertising. Obviously the system and all the questions and answers gives us an insight into what farmers are seeing and experiencing and caring about. And we do, just 10 minutes of airtime on some of the problems. And we find that a really effective way of getting 2,000-3,000 people sometimes in a single kind of 10-minute show that'll sign up. It's a great way to build a brand as well.
Well, it just shows you how much people must be craving this knowledge. Because presumably, economically speaking, for these farmers, it can make a significant difference to their livelihoods, their families, and whatnot. I mean, do you get the stories back of the people's lives you're transforming?
Yeah, we do. Obviously, get a lot of feedback on these kind of things. We have an open feedback channel that anybody on our system can send us feedback for free through SMS, and that pipes into our Slack in the office. So we see it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We don't, obviously help everyone, but I think most interestingly, we're now, looking into the possibilities of using machine learning to actually look at, at impact and how we're potentially affecting farmers across a massive scale. Doing things like looking at references, across millions of pieces of content to harvest and yields, and being able to compare that to national averages and start to see, is there a difference between a farmer using WeFarm and not using WeFarm, and starting to see some cool results out of that. I think often the way you assess impact in the development world, the charity world, is still pretty old school. It's a survey, and people asking you, have you seen a difference with a thing, which is not, it's obviously a lot of bias in that from the start. So just using that kind of machine learning and natural language processing, I think is, for me, I find that quite an exciting way of looking at impact.
Because I was asking Ollie beforehand, do you get to a point where a sandboxed environment almost has the perfect answer to, let's say, potato blight or whatever it might be, and at that point, what's the value to the user of not going to you, the central repository of information, but going to a farmer to then re-answer that question versus having it just stored in the cloud and be accessible to push an SMS back out to him after understanding that question?
So we do both. Obviously we have a big enough bank of knowledge now where there are some questions that we just answer automatically. But I think part of the reason that we get such engagement is because we're still pushing content to people. We often see that a person will ask a question, quite recently after being asked one themselves. So it's great for engagement and keeping people part of the network. And the reality is there's two sides to it. There's some questions that there's just one answer to that you can ping back extremely easily, and there's a lot of things which are very dynamic, in which the answer may be different depending on your soil type or your region, and maybe different from one week to the other. So part of what we try to use machine learning to do is start to look at the differences between those things.
Will farmers be allowed to have conversations with other farmers? Like, if I get into an SMS discussion with somebody and he gives me a good answer, could I build on that and keep messaging back and forth?
Within reason.
Fine.
It's something we're looking into at the moment. It's part of our kind of roadmap that we've seen that obviously people, especially given the medium of SMS, which is quite short, people often have a follow-up question or a clarification, and we are now looking into building a kind of unique link between somebody who's asked and somebody who's answered, so that you can have maybe 4 or 5 follow-up messages. One of the other things in that is also, you might ask a question about rabbits and get a great answer back, but then 6 months later you may ask another rabbit question, and the system just chooses someone entirely different, where actually you want the answer from this person you've started to build a relationship with. So looking at those kind of connections between people, almost like a social network, but obviously for small business owners, very domain specific, and that's probably one of the next steps for us.
Did you know from the start that it would have to be SMS based rather than internet based?
I don't think it was part of day one for us, but by day 2 I think we'd realised that
presumably at some point there's going to be that infrastructure. I know now in Kenya they tend not to have bank accounts, they use M-Pesa, which is mobile based, but one would hope that they would eventually get there where they have proper internet connection and Wi-Fi, and will that affect your business at all?
Yeah, so the data we have from our users suggests that the barrier is not the smartphone at this stage, it's the data prices. So more and more, maybe up to 30% of our users now have a smartphone, but data is prohibitively expensive, so they're still using their smartphone as a feature phone, to call and SMS. So only maybe 3 or 4% of our users are regular internet users. But obviously over the next 5 years, that is going to change and get to an inflection point. I think for us as a business, we look at it, the example we always use for this is Netflix. Have built a massive brand and reputation through sending DVDs through the post to people. They saw the future coming and were able to transition that trust into the next generation of online content. I think we'd want to do something similar. If we have 10 million farmers, maybe more, trusting WeFarm, using it to help their business, to buy products through. Just because they get a smartphone and an internet connection doesn't mean they lose that trust, as long as we're there waiting for them.
And, sorry, presumably your visibility over the needs in the supply chain is unprecedented in terms of you can identify areas that are picking up activity in internet, but user consumer habits are changing, so you're ready to deliver your solution to them almost immediately once they sort of come out of the sort of internet dark ages.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we always say is that if you give a smartphone and an internet connection to a farmer in Uganda at the moment, the content they're accessing, generally speaking, is from a completely different population. It's not written by their neighbour or someone down the road. It's not necessarily relevant for them. But we are building that relevancy in that content that is written by them, and have already a bank of millions and millions of questions and answers that's only going to grow and be there waiting for them online. And yeah, in terms of looking at things in the supply chain, I mean, that's one of the things we do, is that aggregated data piece to look at patterns in the supply chain. We also launched our first marketplace in November last year.
Awesome.
Where we're starting to provide access to products and services to farmers. So starting to, I mean, our vision has always been not to build a question and answer system, but to build an ecosystem for global agriculture, and starting to get there.
Stepping back for a second, and it's sort of, I'm going to crowbar this in because, so we've got an event tonight with General Assembly, at which Ed is doing the keynote. And the theme is from idea to investment. And so what I want to know is how you actually, and it's really difficult in your case, because your platform becomes useful when you have a critical mass of users. So how on earth did you get it to that point where there were enough users who could answer the questions in a quick enough time and valuably enough?
Yeah, with difficulty, and the honest answer is probably in the beginning pretty badly.
Right.
But you just kind of have to throw yourself into it. So I mean, one of the great things that came out of our work with the Cafe Direct Producers Foundation was that we knew quite a lot of farming groups on the ground through other projects and what we'd been doing. So we almost had that audience in which to seed WeFarm. We went to one of those cooperatives we knew in Kenya on our launch day, got 50 of their kind of lead farmers that they had in the cooperative, and ran a competition to see which one could sign up the most farmers over the next 3 days, and offered a small prize. And that took us to our first 500 users in the space of a few days.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of things like that I remember back in the early days, just seeing somebody ask a question on the system was like someone's asked a question, and there was a lot of excitement. Now that's 1 second. On average, somebody asks a question. Seeing it still gives me goosebumps to see hundreds of people signing up a day. But yeah, I mean, you just kind of have to seed it as much as you can.
It's free, right?
It's free.
So it's just a communication thing. If you can get it in front of people and it's something that they need, they're going to get on. So it's just getting that word out there initially.
Exactly, and as you said before, in a pre-internet economy, that's challenging. But it's also one of the great things for us is we're not necessarily competing against very much.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we got there. I mean, initially our algorithms were pretty basic.
Sure, but it'd be crazy to over-engineer fit before you knew what the questions were going to be.
Right. Exactly. I mean, it was a bit scattered on, we would get a question and the system would basically I think you could answer this question. And, we learned a lot, I guess, through obviously building up the learning the mechanisms. And then, eventually we were able to bring tech talent in-house and data science, and, the sophistication of it now is night and day compared to what it was.
So would it be to the degree that it can understand the climate in the region I am and match it to somewhere geographically that has a very similar climate, as well as crop, as well as, whatever else?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, we're it's a kind of constant work in progress for us, all of those kind of different elements. I mean, one of the things that we look at is that, as a kind of indicator of how sophisticated it is the percentage of questions that we're answering within a 24 hours and now within 1 hour, which, if you look back to the beginning of 2018 even, was 45% of questions maybe getting answered within an hour. That's now touching 80% on most days, which is not a complete picture, but it is an indicator of we're taking a piece of information and getting it to the most relevant person pretty quickly. So yeah, I think we're getting there.
These assemblies of knowledge are fantastic to me. I mean, you pointed out with Jimmy Wales is that you're not having to gamify your network. People literally want to contribute to, I guess there's some game theory to it of if we all contribute we'll get answers back, but it's a real cause for positivity when you see systems like this in place, and it's why I love WeFarm, because I just think you're seeing human nature kind of at its cooperative best.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. People ask us this question all the time of why do people answer questions. I mean, obviously there is a dynamic, I think, in all societies of this. It's how Stack Overflow or Wikipedia or any of these things work, because people want to share their knowledge. But I think we have a much more powerful dynamic in that, because generally speaking, we're asking people who've never been asked before. The status quo in this space is generally been to talk down to people. We're not by far from the first people to recognize the problem of lack of access to information in small scale farming, but governments and NGOs have very much tackled it from the top down of, essentially poor people just need to be told what to do. We'll run trainings and we'll give information unto people. Well intentioned, but ultimately that's the way the information flow has gone. And we're certainly at any scale the first people to turn around to a coffee farmer who's been doing it for 30 years and saying, actually, I think there's something valuable in that 30 years of coffee farming. Please, can you help share that with other farmers?
Yeah, I think there was a really nice, I think it was TechCrunch or FT, that the first line was a quote from you, and it said, we're working with people who've never previously been asked for their opinion.
Yeah, and I think that's true, and it's powerful, and it's one of the reasons we get such high engagement.
Yeah.
Well, something nice to touch on here as well is you're dealing with small farmers, which are very distinct from the North American prairie farms and the huge industrial complexes, which I guess to some degree some of these farmers have to compete against. So being able to aggregate their knowledge, I mean, what is the position as you see it between big industrial farming enterprises and these small farmers, and do they act in harmony, or do they just get outcompeted on price?
I mean, that's a big question. I think people probably underestimate just how much of our global supply chain comes from small-scale farming, particularly in the kind of the cash crops like coffee and cocoa and sugar cane and those kind of tropical or subtropical crops. 80-90% of which probably come from a small farm.
Really?
Ultimately there are big industrial coffee farms or pineapple farms out there, but the vast majority of a lot of these crops are coming from small-scale farms. I mean, I think the FAO estimates that about 85%, maybe 80% of the entire global supply chain is coming from small farms. It's a billion people that are running small farms.
Is that sort of where fair trade came from? Because if they're all the small farms growing these, but they had no channel for actually exporting them to the right places, and then sort of a middleman came in and took the margin basically, and then fair trade came in to redress that a bit.
I think theoretically, yeah. I mean, a lot of the fair trade idea was around that kind of more direct relationships and trying to get the farmer a fairer deal in those prices. I think fair trade has been pretty successful as a kind of branding exercise in the Western world. It hasn't necessarily been hugely successful in changing those relationships on the ground. It's such a mammoth task. I mean, one of the, I think, quotes that fair trade uses, that of the average dollar of coffee sold in the US, probably only 1 cent of it is going to the original farmer. And that's probably still largely true, and it's ultimately one of the big things that we see the potential for WeFarm for. At the point where 20 million coffee farmers are using WeFarm, can we start to create those, or decentralize the supply chain ourselves and actually connect those farmers more directly to an international buyer? So yeah, that's one of the things that we're interested in as well.
And would that be part of your strategy for commercial sustainability?
Yeah, so I mean, at the moment, as I say, we just launched our first marketplace, and that's really designed around getting good prices and good quality products to farmers. The fertilizers, the seeds, the things that they're using. The supply chain for this stuff in Kenya and East Africa is it's much like a cocaine supply chain in some ways, where it gets cut with every intermediary dealer. And I think the UN estimates that 91% of fertilizer in Kenya contains at least some fake product. So again, I think now that we represent literally millions of small-scale farmers, we can start to improve that. And obviously that's a business model for us. We're already seeing some exciting kind of metrics coming out of the marketplace, and I think we see it as a really great way to generate significant amounts of revenue for the business. But ultimately, I think it's just the first stage for us. We'd like that to be a two-way marketplace ultimately, where farmers are not only buying their products and services through WeFarm, but able to then sell their crops out where they want to.
That's awesome. So you could pull together basically groups of farmers and buy wholesale on their behalf, and that's extraordinary that people are lacing down fertilizers and stuff. It means they're kind of getting screwed on all sides of the equation. It's like being sold inferior product to grow crops not as well as they could be. What's your concern at the moment with sort of last mile logistics in places like Africa and improving the delivery of these? Is there any ways to improve that don't involve sort of roads and infrastructure?
I'm sure there are. I mean, there's some quite cool companies out there that are doing things with drones.
Yeah.
But ultimately this is a big challenge for us as well. But the situation is improving. We work with retailers and local communities that we authorize as WeFarm retailers and enable them to kind of be the selling point for stuff that we're channeling through the marketplace. But that kind of last mile piece is a huge challenge. But the reality is that most farmers are coming to market regularly anyway, so they're not expecting, there's no dynamic of expecting a delivery to your door. Most people don't have an address anyway, sort of thing that people like What 3 Words are trying to tackle.
There we go.
But I think as this becomes a more established supply chain, the opportunities are going to be there. I think the approach we've always taken for WeFarm, and touching upon as you were saying, grouping farmers together to sell, and people have had these ideas before, but no one's had a platform which to do it. We've kind of come at this space almost the opposite direction from everybody else.
Yeah.
Where rather than try and build a marketplace or a cooperative online or whatever, we've come at it as this, let's build a massive platform which millions of people trust and use. And then we'll start introducing services to them. Then we'll start introducing marketplaces and a way to buy and sell, which I think is a far easier thing to do when you have 1 million people than it is when you have 2.
Yeah, presumably for that sort of strategy, it requires a lot of backing, because presumably you ran for a while before. I don't know if you are actually commercially sustainable now, but at the start you would have needed a lot of backing to achieve that amount of growth.
Yeah, we're generating revenue now, but we're very much a growth based startup.
Yeah.
Our goal here is to build the platform for the entire global small scale agricultural space. We've done 2 venture capital rounds to date, one in the UK and one in the US, and we're currently in the middle of doing our 3rd.
Well, I thought one was really recent.
It's amazing how quickly time flies.
Yeah.
So we did one back in 2016 that was led by Local Globe here in London.
Yeah.
And then at the end of 2017, we did a big seed round with True Ventures in Silicon Valley.
That was 2017.
End of 2017. We didn't announce it until about April of 2018,
right.
so about a year ago.
That has got all the big names on it, that round.
Getting True Ventures to back us was unexpected, but absolutely huge for us. They're behind Peloton, Ring, Fitbit. They're doing one of the best seed funds in the whole of the US and the Silicon Valley scene. And
with some of the individuals as well, like Niklas Zennström and Matt Mullenweg.
Yeah, I think in venture capital space, once you get one big name, everybody wants involved, and it's there's a certain herd mentality to this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah,
you missed out on DiCaprio.
Yeah, he's been active. I can't remember what he invested into.
I've met Leo.
Have you?
Leo, I say.
Go on.
Very briefly at the Scottish Business Awards a couple of years ago, I had a meet and greet.
Well, he's very passionate about climate issues, isn't he?
Yeah, I mean, if he's listening, he should definitely get involved.
I wish he was listening.
He's a regular listener, I heard.
Jimmy Wales retweeted us the other day, so he's been listening. Well, he's not been listening, I don't know, maybe he just retweets. But so actually, as a UK company going to San Francisco, was it difficult to get access to people like True Ventures? I mean, what was your in?
So yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, I've just spent 2 weeks there, raising our next round, and even with a top Silicon Valley investor, it's still hard. I think maybe 40 or 50% of funds in the US won't look at a non-Bay Area company. Never
non-Bay Area,
right? I mean, never mind Africa and ag tech and all those kind of other weird things that we have around us. But there are. In the US, probably, a few in the UK and European scene, and probably more in the US, who are truly conviction-led, VCs who are truly looking for that, almost crazy stuff that no one else is touching. And True are definitely, they're the type of fund that are looking for really genuine global ideas that no one else is thinking about. And so I think there was a really natural fit with us.
So you're pitching we're going to be the global network for farming.
Yeah, I mean that is our ambition. Like, I mean, it sounds like a throwaway line, but small scale agriculture is literally the biggest industry on earth. It's 1 billion people. It's 80% of the global supply chain. It's 4 out of 5 of the most traded commodities on earth. Apart from oil, obviously.
Yeah.
And no one's built a platform for it.
Yeah.
Well, and when we talk about impact, because it's such a buzzword at the moment, impact investing. If you can get access to an information exchange with all these farmers on it, and if you can create a 1% improvement in their practices in terms of the amount of fertilizer consumed, that is a huge 1 billion people using like 1% less fertilizer. It's like a huge effect in terms of for the betterment of the planet, or climate practices, or sustainable agriculture.
I heard something really interesting
earlier.
So, cows contribute a lot to agriculture of cows, contributes a lot to global warming, and climate change. Apparently, if you mix seaweed, some sort of seaweed product into what you're feeding them, it reduces the amount of carbon, methane damage by 95%.
Huh.
So if you could, obviously there is problematic to just suddenly apply that everywhere, and obviously there's a cost about getting the seaweed. But if you can get to a point where you can communicate that really quickly, suddenly you can have a massive effect in a short time.
Well, to my way of thinking, it's way better to give you £1 million to go and acquire another 500,000 users than it is to put £1 million into something that's not seen the light of day, that may be solving a more niche problem. But I mean, with that in mind, you said small farmers. Would you be in a position to help farmers in America, North America, like smaller farms there? I mean, is that your global ambition?
I mean, potentially. We get a fair number of requests from farmers in the Western world, Wales, Switzerland, all sorts of places. So farmers who are kind of interested in that dynamic of sharing knowledge with each other. I think it's something fairly universal that humans want to use. It's probably not our niche and our specialty at the moment. I mean, where we really add significant value is to farmers that probably don't have any other access to information systems. And there are people working on very sophisticated, smart systems for farms in the Western world, smart tractors, all the rest of it. And I guess the big vision for us is probably mostly focused on developing markets. Of the billion small scale farmers, the vast majority are in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. 130 million in India alone. But yeah, I mean, sure, why not? I mean, at the point where we are becoming that global player, I would like to see us be used everywhere.
Pushing it a little bit into the sort of future. Would you guys integrate with sort of some of the satellite data going around to sort of keep tabs on the landscape, the farming, the degradation going on? Is that of any interest to you or Google, with them backing you? Yeah,
so I mean, I've always thought that the biggest social impact we can create through WeFarm is actually through the data. I mean, I hope we give information to individual people that is valuable to them, and we now do have good evidence that it does support farmers to yield more, to generate more income. But the power of our data is huge, I think. Looking at the potential to track disease outbreaks, foot and mouth disease, coffee rust, whatever it might be, it might take months for that to come to light in rural Africa at the moment. We could potentially do that in a couple of hours. At the point where you can start to alert local NGOs or local government about these kind of things, you're potentially supporting and helping people that aren't even using your platform. And some of the power to do that, forecasting drought and disease, there's obviously commercial value in that for us as a business, but like humongous social impact potential, I think, as well.
Because that's part of my uncertainty with the activities of NGOs is it's really hard to know what the impact on the ground is of them going and, let's say, planting loads of trees. Like, does that help? What does it do to the ecosystem? Because sometimes it's very easy to just go put in this kind of tree because. And it's like there's a biodiversity issues and all sorts, and I'd just be interested to know if that's combined with that sort of very data-led approach, that it's something you want to solve in the future.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, I've seen examples of exactly that, where I worked in Peru, eucalyptus trees had been recommended for decades. They were perfect trees. Everyone thought they grow extremely quickly, very hardwood, and they're very straight growing, so they're kind of perfect building material. And then, of course, eventually everyone figured out that they're desert trees, by origin, and we're sucking up all of the water systems, and we're ruining habitats and such like. And it often takes a few years for people to cotton onto these. There's no such thing as a perfect solution. So I've got some experience with that, and yeah, I mean, I think we see the power of having a united platform for agriculture. Commercially, socially, in terms of the sustainability aspect. it's all stepping stones for us. At the point where we have literally tens of millions of farmers, we can help them with that 1% less fertilizer, with maybe not using fertilizer at all, but a much more sustainable, organic solution. It's going to take us a while to get there, but with every step and every new farmer that kind of joins us, we have more potential, I think, to affect these things.
Yeah, I mean, if you're at 1.5 million farmers now, and you're entering the super funded growth, real scale up stages, like potentially it won't be that long.
I hope not. I mean, not quite super funded yet, but maybe pretty soon. But yeah, I mean that's the idea. I mean, I think we've spent 2 or 3 years learning the playbooks in the tech language, learning how we acquire users. We're now learning a lot about the monetization side and building out the marketplace. I think we'll look to really consolidate that over this A round phase for the next 18 months, and then the idea is really to do a big growth round to take this globally. Right. We've learned the lessons, now let's replicate it in 20 different countries.
Yeah. And then SoftBank.
God.
We've had our first meeting with SoftBank, which went really well.
I'm not surprised you have. I'm really not surprised you have.
There's a serious vision behind them, don't they? Massive.
Yeah, and I think something that kind of appeals to them and their philosophy about things as well.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think for us, it's there's so much potential out there, but also trying to focus the team on just winning the everyday battles.
Sure.
Like every company, all these things sound great, but every day we have to kind of struggle to get through a myriad of challenges.
Could I understand a bit more about the commercial side of the business model? So is that B2B that you sorry, I've got you.
Sorry.
Inopportune time. But is it a B2B model that you make revenue off at the moment? I mean, marketplace will obviously come into effect, but
largely, I mean, I think where we've generated most of the revenue to date has been that data piece. Helping companies look into their supply chain, looking at the aggregated data that comes out of our system.
So do they pay you a licensing model to get access to that data for?
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, I think most of the work we've done has been fairly kind of small scale pilots, paid, but both of us learning from each other, kind of thing. But I think what we're really focused on now is the marketplace angle. We're already seeing pretty incredible traction coming out of that. We only launched it in November, and already 20+% of the farmers who've bought through it have already bought again. And we've always believed that we're building a value proposition for farmers, and starting to see that happen is awesome. And I think we have a very low cost of acquisition of a user, about 30 cents, and so it doesn't take much for this to start become a kind of engine of sustainability and profitability, and I think that's what we want to make sure we're building. As we look towards that super funding and such, like, we need to show that not only can we be massively scalable in the information side of things, but that we are massively scalable in the revenue side of things. I don't think, personally, I've always believed there's nothing wrong with having both social impact and massive commercial potential. I mean, I truly believe those are the kind of things that are going to change the world, to use the buzz phrase. And so, we are determined, I think, to prove both sides of those coin.
Yeah, I mean, I think the mistake that people often make when they think about social impact is that they sort of misconstrue it and think it's philanthropy. And so actually you really want to tie these commercial strategies to an impact-led approach in order to make the real meaningful changes, not just developing an app for, I don't know, dog litter or something that's not.
But they're highly efficient. You're right. The very definition of a startup operating with lean principles is your capital will use as effectively as possible. Should the end outcome be aligned, right? So yours is to actually affect the lives of the farmer. So the more money goes in, the more farmers you get, the more lives you affect. Not every startup operates that way. Sometimes it can be lost into R&D spend or a product that never sees the light of day that will be an agri-tech product. But in this specific example, you're spot on. Yeah, it is the most efficient way, I think, to affect that change.
But it's like if you're solving one of the biggest problems, surely you want the capital to hire the best talent, to reward those who are dedicating their time to it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's something that I'm really passionate about, actually, is even within charities, trying to change some of those mentalities, where a lot of the charity models works really well at small scale for local soup kitchens, for those kind of small scale, charity projects. But, we're now looking at a lot of charities that are trying to solve the biggest problems on earth. And you don't do that by not hiring great talent. Somebody pointed out much smarter than me that it's kind of crazy as a society that we want to financially incentivize people to go and work in a stock exchange more than to get the brightest minds of our generation working on these challenges. And there's nothing wrong with paying proper salaries to people to work on them.
Agreed.
And I think that's something we really do need to shift the dynamic on. And I think where, you know, social enterprise or mission-driven tech, whatever you want to call it, I think you're now seeing a second generation come through where, you know, the first generation was very much have a normal business and then give something to charity, you know, give a pair of shoes or a donation or 20p out of every pound or whatever it might be. And I think you're now seeing a second generation where actually the social impact is just embedded in the engine of business. And that is what I think we're passionate about at WeFarm, and I know a lot of people are getting on side with.
Yeah. How do you feel about climate change generally?
I don't like it.
No, I hate it. I'm really worried about it. But I mean, from a WeFarm perspective, is it? I mean, it's not really a risk that you can factor in, because it's a risk that just applies generally to everyone. But I think it is going to be small-scale farmers that get affected first, and flooding and drought almost simultaneously.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that kind of on the front line of climate change sounds like a newspaper headline, but it's absolutely true. Actually, one of the biggest projects we did at the Cafe Direct Foundation before WeFarm was on climate change for tea farmers, and actually got one of the universities to model out climate change over the next 50 years.
In that place?
In Uganda,
right.
This was in some of Kenya, and, you know, a lot of which, you know, tea is a monoculture, it's whole landscapes and communities, and a 1 degree temperature difference essentially makes tea, you know, unviable. And
we're already past that,
right? And the big multinationals obviously will just move 100 miles up the road, or, you know, wherever it is, to, you know, where tea is now viable again, and then entire communities are, you know, left without any kind of income. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, obviously the tropics is a very kind of traditionally stable climate where the rains came at very fixed times, which you're now seeing dramatically change. So yeah, I mean, I think small scale farmers are obviously they're the abused part of the supply chain in every sense, and they are going to be the people that feel this the most, and already are. Yeah,
what happens when you get the question on WeFarm, how do I stop climate change?
we do get some big questions like that even machine learning is unable to answer. But a lot of the questions we get, you know, anecdotally, you know, 30-40% are in some way related to climate change, of people seeing diseases they haven't seen before, right. You know, animals behaving differently.
These are the symptoms of it.
Right. And this, you are genuinely seeing, say, you know, coffee grows in much the same microclimates wherever it is in the globe. You know, a coffee farm in Peru looks very much like a coffee farm in Uganda. And diseases that have only existed potentially on the other side of the world through slight changes are now becoming, you know, major problems in other parts of the world. So, you know, we're already seeing the impact of this. It's one of the big projects we've actually done on the data side is, you know, compare our human side of it to the actual data side of it. So obviously the meteorologists have, you know, lots of weather data, whether it's hot or it's cold or whatever. But how does that affect the way that people ask questions on WeFarm? You know, so if we can see that things are getting colder or it's raining more than it was this time last year, can you see a trend or a difference in the way that people are talking to each other? Which is a really interesting project for us.
Well, of course, because generations of farmers will forgive, you know, sort of events that happen a couple of times in a lifetime. They'll be like, you know, your grandparents saw this happen, this is not unbeknown for the area to happen. Whereas you'll know the sentiment will change and be significantly less confident if it's something that none of the community, because if you're a farmer every day and you've grown coffee for the last 40 to 50 years in your family, you'll know what to expect and how to sort of mitigate for these things. Whereas if they're seeing things that they've never seen before, it's terrifying. And the worst thing is that with all of these issues, I think the people causing it are so divorced from the outcome, which is that, as you rightfully said, loads of people being supplied by small farmers. But when you go to the supermarket aisle and just pick up your bag of coffee roast, you have no idea. You just assume it's one company, which has been put under a marketing label and served up to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously been a growing trend in you know, most of the Western markets towards this kind of origin and you know, where does your products come from, and people kind of are I think more conscious than they were 10 years ago. But overall, as a society, I mean, most people probably don't even know you know, how tea starts as a plant, or you know, all of those kind of things. And there is a remarkable divorce between the two ends of the supply chain.
And even if you do know, like, it's still hard to actually act on it. You feel like as an individual, you know, lots of people I know are trying to eat less meat because that has quite a big effect.
Right.
But I mean, it's going to take, given the rate things are happening, it's going to take more than those individual changes, which have to happen as well. But it's going to take a lot more than that to counteract what's going on, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also really difficult for consumers to kind of separate the marketing spin from the reality.
Yeah.
Is that obviously increasingly brands are aware of the fact that they have to have some sort of social impact or project,
Yeah.
and they're all talking about we do this, or we plant this number of trees, or we help gangs, or whatever, and it's
We help gangs.
yeah, I mean, there's all of this stuff, and it's it's one of the things that Cafe Direct faced a lot of. They were the pioneers of this space. 20 years ago, if you wanted to buy an ethical coffee, you bought Cafe Direct. But in the modern day, you just look at a shelf and everybody is saying the same things, and it's impossible to know how much of that is entirely superficial. And Starbucks planting 10,000 trees, I don't know if that's real, but just as an example, that's nothing. It's literally pennies for them. How can you separate that from the company that's actually doing really good stuff? And I think unless you do an incredible amount of
digging,
then it's really difficult to know.
Do you know about B Corp status?
Of course, yeah.
I think that's quite a good way, but it's only, I mean, for the everyday consumer to go, I'm going to look up to see that if this coffee brand is B Corp over this one,
right?
Like it's quite intense to do that.
And there's now endless numbers of seals and certificates. I mean, even in coffee, there's rainforest and organic and fair trade, and again, everybody's at it in some way or other, and it's impossible to know what the differences are.
Yeah, just sloganeering.
Yeah.
Well, because there's also and I would like to get your opinion on this. There's going to be a bit of a population crisis. They assume that sub-Saharan Africa is going to be a cause for a huge population growth in the next sort of few decades. Are you seeing the effects of that already in terms of mouths to feed?
I don't think we're seeing the effects of it necessarily yet, but yeah, I mean, I think people quite often ask us if we see farming going the same way as the Western world, where kind of dozens of small farms eventually kind of merge into one super farm, which is, I guess, what we've seen ultimately in the UK and other economies. And actually, I think certainly in the short to medium term, it's likely to go in the opposite direction. One of the big problems they have is parents having 12 children, and the land then having to be split up amongst 10 kids, or 6 male kids, or whatever it might be in the local culture, and you start to see this massive amount of land pressure where farms are getting ultimately divided into sizes that are unsustainable, that don't actually grow any kind of income, and there's quite a few places in East Africa where that's starting to become a problem. So it's related to population growth, but ultimately we are not growing enough food as a global society to feed everyone that is going to live in this planet in 10 years time, or 20 years time. The massive scale super farms in the Western world are probably pretty close to peak production. You can probably eke out a few more percentage points, but really what's going to change that is the small scale farms, and that's I guess where we come in and what we're passionate about. The average hectare or acre or whatever identification you want to use is about 1/5 as productive in most of Africa as it is in in the US or the UK, and we'd like to help change that.
Do you have any views on lab grown foods?
I mean, to be honest, I don't know enough about it. It's not something that we touch very much every day.
I just mean in general.
I mean, I genuinely don't know enough about it, I think, to comment.
I just wonder if, a lot of people say that if they can get the cost down for that, then there's a real viable alternative for this mass production of especially meat farming.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the theory is definitely there. I mean, we are. I mean, again, people probably want to just turn a blind eye to this stuff, but we are. The global population is growing at a rate which is unsustainable for the farming we currently have, and so one way or other, new solutions have to be found.
Yeah, I suspect the solution will be catastrophic, and it'll be climate change.
Well, and particularly for people to adopt a Western quality of life, and that's the big issue. I mean, I remember going to India and thinking, thank God that embedded within the religion is to not eat beef. For most people, because that would be just beyond reason to be able to try and supply that. And the problem is if you address the issue of population and just saying there simply will be too many people on planet Earth, some people go, would you suggest genocide? And it's like, of course not, but we need a solution, otherwise we're going to bump into it head first. James from Lab Genius said it's a bit like bacteria in a petri dish, and eventually there's not enough agar jelly for them to sit and feed off, and it's not, then there's no prejudice about who gets wiped out. Then it's just simply people in the equator. It's
just like an ecosystem, and in an ecosystem, when it reaches a capacity point, it can't
collapses
things, and if things can't, so maybe the solution is go to Mars.
Well, we're trying.
Something like that.
Elon's on it, I think.
Yes, Elon and Jeff are having a race.
I think something actually I think is really interesting about what culturally you've done with WeFarm is Africa is a hugely complicated place in terms of religious beliefs, tribal beliefs, national borders and stuff, and you're getting this cohesion presumably independently of any of those factors of people just coming together, which I think is kind of awesome.
Everyone's got to eat.
Yeah, but isn't it nice that technology is actually, because what we have a problem with like Twitter is people form these sort of sentiment silos and then argue with each other, but actually this is technology in the truest sense of bringing people together, presumably of all different walks and backgrounds.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that we have actually, and probably this is why it's been successful, is we haven't actually really thought about that side of things too much. We've just let people use it naturally. We've also obviously tried to make sure that the community is respectful, and we actually find, like always, the most powerful way to do that is have the community police itself. And when people ask inappropriate questions or spam, which obviously the scale we're operating, well, not necessarily a lot, but even a small percentage is a lot when you're doing things at a big scale. But people very quickly, this is not appropriate content for WeFarm, this is a farming network, please only ask a farming question, and that actually gives me a lot of pride to see people defending this thing that they feel proud of. And yeah, I mean, we've one of the questions I remember asking when we first set up WeFarm was when we send an answer to somebody, should we include a name? Will people start to draw conclusions just from the name and disregard advice? Say in certain cultures where it might be that a woman's advice wouldn't be as listened to as a man's advice, or certain names might give away certain kind of religious origins or whatever. And we decided to go for it and just give a name, and actually no one batted an eyelid. And
really? That's so cool.
I mean, I'm glad that we kind of went with the natural approach to these things, because I think as soon as you start trying to divide people, even with good intention, it snowballs. And some of the stuff that you're seeing coming out of Facebook or some of the big social networks,
Twitter has been dragged through the mud with their interview with Joe Rogan about policing who can get deplatformed. Right. And it's like they're caught in a really difficult thing where they're not deferring to the US law, which is the country of origin where they're founded, and they are becoming their own jurisdiction over a huge user base. Right. And it's very difficult to get right because you're always going to upset somebody. Right.
I think people underestimate just how difficult it is when you're dealing with 1 billion people like Facebook. I think some genuinely bad stuff has gone on at Facebook, and but I suspect that quite a lot of it just started with good intention, and nobody quite realised how this would affect things at 1 billion people. I mean, no one's done it before. You're not a car manufacturer, building it on top of 100 years of car building knowledge. You're kind of more like Henry Ford doing this for the first time, which I don't think excuses a lot of the stuff that's gone on, but I think there is just an element of.
But he would have dealt with like motor car deaths. It would have been like, oh shit, we've created this vehicle, now people are crashing it. Right. What do we do now? It's like, of course, there's going to be issues with big visions. I think
the scale is just inconceivable. Yeah. Before it's just.
There's one of my favorite Twitter TED Talks. Is one of the head of security at Twitter, who outlining that I think a 1 in a million incident happens in Twitter like every 8 seconds. A 1 in a billion incident happens several times a day. Just the scale of this is inconceivable, and actually our minds are not set up to be able to think about this. You're saying when you're dealing with this kind of scale, even if 0.001% of stuff is anomalous or bad, that's going to be a lot of things.
Right, and on our compressed time sense, that feels highly frequent. I mean, I think so. I have a belief that this is why people are becoming so emotional, because you just data overload, that you can't take an objective viewpoint if you try, because all sides of the argument are being presented at almost all times, at all instances, in incalculable numbers as well. And so people just carve through all of this data with just emotion and vitriol, and they get angry about stuff, because how else do you navigate it? You can't absorb it. It doesn't exist on a human. So like we're talking like beyond terabytes of data per second. It's of course these platforms are facing just like mind-boggling issues. Right.
But so like at its core, like knowledge sharing is one of the most powerful tools that we can have, and like that's it's the whole Yuval Noah Harari thing about stories, and that's how stories get passed on generations. It's how we learn ethics, how we learn farming. It's why Hesiod and I can't remember 9th century BC wrote the Works and Days, which is an early Greek hexameter poem about agricultural techniques, and like this is like the culmination of that, and it's that knowledge sharing done right, but in the WeFarm, but in other areas like Twitter, where it's just everything. Like, how do you then police? Like, how do you make Twitter a force for good? Like,
Very hard.
Because you can't manage it. No one can manage it.
But your revenue model's tied into something that actually affects the users in a real world sense. The problem is when advertising comes in as a business model, then it's corrupted at the core. So your network expands, but you can help them with real commoditized product. I think the issue with Facebook or with Twitter is like, you have to make revenue for your shareholders.
Yeah.
What's that going to come at the expense of?
Right. And we're going to face some of the same challenges as well. I mean, we have, obviously good intention in this, and but it's not some golden space where we're not going to face any problems at all. We have a social mission at the heart of what we do, but we have to keep coming back to that as an organization. And I think it's very easy to take decisions with good intention. Again, if you extrapolate it out to 100 million users, it might not be as good. So it's something as a company that we want to come back to again and again, and it doesn't mean we don't have problems.
But I mean, like, how would you? The consequence of you deplatforming a user is like now could be the